everyone, we're here to tell you about the Venture Maidens podcast.
For lifelong gamers.
For longtime friends.
Doing a real play 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons podcast.
Including such themes as
Awkward NPC romance.
Darts to the butt.
Chopping things with axes.
Find us on iTunes, Spreaker, Twitter, Facebook, or Twitch.
New episodes every other Sunday.
Or every other Wednesday on Twitch.
Check out our website, www.theventuremaidens.com.
And start the quest today. Until then, venture away.
This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. This week on the show, I'm talking with Rodney Thompson. Rodney is a great dude who has worked on the Star Wars RPG, Dungeons & Dragons, and the hit video game Destiny. Now, Rodney's kickstarting a new tabletop RPG called Dusk City Outlaws, and it's all about heists. Let's jump right into the good stuff. Here's my conversation with Rodney. Okay, everybody, now I am here with Rodney Thompson, game design legend. Rodney, welcome to Tabletop Babble. How are you?
I am great, thank you. And I think that legend is definitely overstating it.
I do not think so at all. You sort of have an amazing story, a meteoric rise, if you will, in this industry of gaming. And I'm so excited because we're going to talk about the heist game that you are putting out right now, an amazing RPG that I got a chance to play last night because I'm here at Winter Fantasy. But before we get started, why don't you tell the people out there sort of about your first time laying hands on a tabletop role-playing game? You know, what role did you play in the game and how did it go? How did you discover it?
The first time I ever actually played a tabletop RPG, it was 2nd edition D&D, and it was right when Al-Qadim came out. So I think this was like 93, 94. It was pretty early 90s. I was like 13, 14, something like that. And a guy that I went to high school with was like, hey, I'm going to run a D&D campaign. Would you like to play? And I had kind of heard of D&D back when I was like 7, 8, 9 years old, somewhere in that range. And this kid like down the block from me was like, yeah, I played this game where I was like a halfling ranger and I had a sling and I dipped my sling bullets in oil and lit them on fire. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This makes no sense, and it sounds amazing. But I didn't really understand what he meant, because the only context I had for games was like Nintendo games and then also like Magic the Gathering and stuff like that. Magic had just started to catch on in my high school, my junior high, a year or two after it came out. And so I had no concept of what D&D was. And this guy, who I just knew because we ran in the same circles, was like, hey, join my D&D campaign. And it was an Al-Qadim campaign. And it was me and my best friend and this guy that was running it and his sister. And there might have been one more player, but I can't remember. But I know it was at least the 4 of us, the 3 players, and then the guy that was introducing to me was the DM. And I played a Holy Slayer, a member of the religious order that are assassins, and completely fell in love with it. And even to this day, Al-Qadim is by far my favorite D&D campaign setting. But we played that sort of on Saturdays for a year or so, and then I switched over to my primary game became the West End game Star Wars RPG, and that's where I really, really cut my teeth on role-playing games.
Yeah, absolutely. And so after that, how do you make the transition to the professional world? And I think your experience with Star Wars has a lot to do with that, right?
It does. And, I really started out because I was just a fan of the game. And I had run a West End game Star Wars campaign through like parts of high school, kind of off and on. And I'd taken all these notes. And I was getting ready to go off to college in the fall of 1998. And the university had given me my email account. And like you had like you got 4 megabytes of storage space to put up things on the web or whatever, right? And so I took all my notes, converted them over to HTML format, and uploaded them to this site so that I didn't have to take all these notebooks and every loose leaf paper with me to college, and I could just leave them at home. this was back in the days when there weren't a whole lot of fan sites for RPGs. I mean, it's nothing like it is today. And people started finding the stuff that I'd uploaded and emailing me and asking me questions. And I was like, oh, well, if people are looking at this, I better reformat it. And then, like, halfway through my freshman year, I rebuilt the site entirely and bought a domain and all this other stuff. And basically built up this fan site and joined forces with another guy who was really great at, web programming and stuff. And we set up this fan site that became like, I mean, for a while there, we were probably one of the premier Star Wars RPG fan sites. This was around the time that the D20 Star Wars game was starting to come into existence. It was around the time that I teamed up with this guy. And so I started covering the previews we were getting of the D20 Star Wars game, a year before it actually came out, so I kind of built up this following and everything of people that were like checking the site every day. And I had set a goal for myself because I was a freshman in college and suddenly found myself with way more free time than I had had in high school. I set a goal for myself that every day I'm going to post one new piece of content, whether that is an interview with a Wizards designer or, stat blocks that I create myself or an adventure or whatever, just one new piece of content every day. And over the course of several years, like I stuck to that for the most part. I mean, there were, the occasional weekends where I didn't put anything out, but for a long time I was putting, one new piece of content out. And at the point where I've got 2 or 1,500, 2,000 pieces of content in the database, like it was a pretty hefty site. And Chris Perkins, who is now the face of D&D, but at the time was the editor on Star Wars, contacted me and he was like, hey, we see you're putting out regular content on, a very frequent basis. Would you like a shot at writing a source book for us and co-writing? Like, there was a Wizards designer in-house, J.D. Weicker, who is a friend of mine now that I met through this. He was going to lead the design, then I was going to supplement the design with additional work. But we split the design load about 60-40 with me at the 40. And this was the Hero's Guide for the Star Wars Revised. And it couldn't have come at a better time because I was kind of looking at, like, I might have to drop out of college because I couldn't afford to pay my tuition. My parents were helping me, but it was just, like they were also putting my brother through school. And so, it couldn't have come at a better time. It allowed me to stay in college, and it also kicked off a freelance career. After I got that gig for Wizards, that following summer, that was in like November of, I want to say 2000-ish, maybe 2001. I can't remember exactly. But that following summer, I went to Gen Con for the first time. I'd never been before. It was the last year it was in Milwaukee. So figure out what year that was, walk it back a year from that, and that's when I started this freelance thing. But I went to Milwaukee. My brother and I flew out of Nashville, Tennessee. We were living in Knoxville and flew out of Nashville, went to Gen Con for the first time. We're completely blown away by Gen Con because it was like nothing that we had ever seen in our East Tennessee, had nothing like that. I was like, wait a minute, people take role-playing games seriously? What is this? But I walked around and I started to talk to publishers, and I was like, hey, yeah, I just got done writing a freelance book for Wizards of the Coast, and immediately people were like, oh, this was at the advent of the D20 boom, right? Like, this is early days of OGL, and they're like, hey, we've got this product line we're spinning up, send us some writing samples or whatever. And because I'd kind of trained myself to put out regular content, I had no problem producing the material that was needed to launch this freelance career. And so then for the next 6 years, I freelanced for, Wizards, but also Green Ronin and Paizo and West End Games and, companies that aren't even around anymore, and built that up into like a freelance career that then got parlayed into my job at Wizards and continued that for 8 years. So, yeah.
So you were a freshman in college when you wrote that very first source book, and then you just kept going from there?
I think I was a junior by the time I got to there.
Gotcha.
I was a freshman when I launched the website, but I think that was my third year of college when I started doing the freelancing. But yeah, I was in college. Actually, that was a really rough year for me because I was a full-time college student. I was freelancing for Wizards, which is like having a second job, right? Mm-hmm. I also worked in the mornings at a t-shirt shop. I would get up at like 6 a.m., go to this t-shirt shop and spend about 3 hours in the mornings scrubbing the screens they used to print t-shirts, right?
Right. Right.
Then I would go to class. I was taking a full class load. I was still majoring in computer science at the time. Then after classes were over in the afternoon, I would go to the mall and I worked at electronics boutique. So if you look at it that way, I had full-time college plus 3 jobs, and that I was able to keep that up for about a year before it completely fried me, and I had to give up the T-shirt printing job and go down to just 2 jobs.
You are the original bootstrap guy, I guess, right?
I mean, kind of, right? Like I'm very fortunate, right? That
Sure.
like if Chris Perkins hadn't looked at my website and seen the stuff that I was doing, or if I hadn't managed to cultivate a relationship with those designers that I was interviewing, like they wouldn't have even known that I existed, right? So I'm very fortunate in that regard, and I'm also really fortunate that a lot of publishers were willing to take a chance on, like, well, here's this 20-year-old kid. Like the first year I went to Gen Con, I don't think I could even drink yet, right? Here's this 20 kid that is freelancing for Wizards. Like I could have been totally unreliable. They didn't know, right? But I was fortunate that it was at a time when they had a great need for freelancers, and I was able to build up that career by being in kind of the right place at the right time.
That's awesome. So you freelance for about 6 years, and
Yeah.
then you start working full time at Wizards of the Coast. Is that how
That's right.
you
Yep.
make the jump? Right?
I got hired by Wizards in 2007, early 2007, to run the Star Wars product line because I had helped write the Saga Edition rulebook with Owen Stevens and Chris Perkins, and they hired me to come run the product line in Wizards. So I packed up everything I owned and moved from Knoxville, Tennessee, out to Seattle, which was terrifying for me in my mid-20s, not really yet being an adult. But yeah, then I moved out here in 07. So I've been out here right at 10 years and worked at Wizards for 8 of those years. Worked on the Star Wars RPG, led that product line until it lapsed. Then I moved over to Dungeons and Dragons and worked on some D&D 4th edition supplements. I was the lead developer of the Dark Sun books for 4th edition D&D. And worked on some board games. I co-designed Lords of Waterdeep and Dungeon Command, and then eventually Tyrants of the Underdark, working with Peter Lee and other designers and developers there. Had the great fortune to be able to work on 5th edition D&D. I was sort of there at the inception of the game, in working with Mike and Jeremy and Bruce Cordell and Rob Schwab and all those guys. And for 3 years, my life was basically all D&D 5th edition, right? From a year before the first open playtest or more, we were working on it internally, and that just was all consuming. And then worked on that all the way through all the core books, and then I worked on the first 2 adventures, I want to say, as a developer. So I worked on, Tyranny of Dragons, I think, was the first one, then Elemental Evil. I worked on those adventures as a developer, and then I left Wizards to take a job at Bungie.
Which is also pretty awesome. I think people probably have heard of Halo before. And maybe a little game called Destiny.
Indeed. Yes. Yep, I've been working on Destiny for about a year and a half, almost 2 years now, and it's been great. I was worried I wasn't going to be able to make that transition from tabletop to video games, but actually all of the lessons that I learned over the last 15 years, really, I'm able to sort of bring those to bear. It's different tools and different gameplay speed in a lot of ways, but most of the principles are actually still the same. So yeah, I've been very fortunate, and I'm very thankful for the fact that I've gotten to have a long career where I've worked on some really great games, and also been able to work alongside some of the most talented designers in the industry, learned so much. I always think of it Wizards of the Coast wasn't just a job. Wizards of the Coast was 8 years of learning how to design games from the best people, right, and the brightest people, and working alongside some of the most talented designers I've ever had the fortune to work with. And now I work at Bungie, which is it's like being on an all-star team. Everybody's at the top of their field, so it's pretty great, and I'm very lucky to be where I am.
So are the people at Bungie, are they fans of Dungeons and Dragons? Are they playing 5th edition? And is that, where they're like, oh, you made this game and we played it?
Yeah, it's really funny. I have some kind of funny experiences because tons and tons of people at the studio play D&D or board games or whatever, but my core team that I work with, when I first started working there, there's about 10 to 12 people that are on the team that I'm on. When I first started working there, they were like, oh, this guy worked on tabletop games, but they didn't know exactly what I'd worked on or anything like that. And other people in the studio that, weren't on my team did. Like, they were big D&D fans or Lords of Waterdeep fans or whatever. And so over the course of like the first couple of months of me being there, people would come up to my desk and be like, dude, you worked on Lords of Waterdeep or 5th edition or whatever, and they would want to talk about it. And everybody around me was just like, why do people keep coming up to you and talking to you? I'm like, well, it's because we have a ton of D&D players here or whatever, and they didn't quite make that connection because while they play tabletop games, they're not super plugged into like who makes what or like who's this designer, or maybe they didn't follow the open playtest process because during the 5th edition open playtest, I answered the rule of 3 questions for a really long, like I want to say like over a year. I was answering rule of 3 and was on live streams and got to be kind of a public face for the game, which was really nice. But a lot of the people I work with didn't quite get that. So there have been a few sort of funny moments where people get surprised that like this guy that's been sitting next to them working on Destiny also has this completely other life as a tabletop games designer. When Penny Arcade announced that I was working on the Thornwatch game for them, there was a lot of people in the studio that, because Penny Arcade is primarily a video games focused website, a lot of people were coming up to me like, dude, I didn't even know you did tabletop games. I'm like, yeah, man, that's how I got here, right? So, there have been some funny rude awakening moments, and there have been some funny moments where we have a really great policy at Bungie where if you're a new hire, you can have lunch with other people in the studio, and the company pays for that lunch so that you can get to know people, right? And I had a funny moment where a guy that we had just hired came up and he was like, dude, I really want to do new hire lunch with you and talk about all the games that you've worked on. And I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. And like, separately later in the day, somebody came up to me and they're like, hey, did you know that this new guy is going around the studio telling everybody how excited he is to go have lunch with you? And I was just like, okay, great. And so like, it's so funny because it's a completely different world. There is some of that excitement that wouldn't necessarily be like, this person I work with worked on this other video game that I really liked, and now I have a lot of respect for them because the worlds are just different enough, and it's just kind of like a different discipline enough. I get those sort of charged moments of excitement. But I also think like, D&D is one of those games that is deeply rooted in a lot of game designers' brains and lives and stuff like that. So when I can say like, oh yeah, I got to work on D&D for 5 years or whatever, there's a lot of people that energizes them in a way that like, oh yeah, I worked on whatever video game, maybe doesn't create that moment of excitement for. So yeah, it's funny sometimes and different. But then I also have those moments with them. Like there's one of the other people that's kind of at my level in the company. She worked on Dragon Age and Mass Effect, and when she came in, I was like, oh man, I'm super big fan of this and this. Did you have anything to do with that? And she was like, yeah, I designed this mission or quest or whatever, right? And so she and I get along smashingly because like we can kind of geek out over each other's accomplishments.
And you really were such a big part of the public-facing side of the D&D Next playtest and 5th edition being developed, and it was very interesting. I felt like that process was more transparent than Wizards had been in the past creating other editions of D&D, right? Because there was that 2-year-long playtest, and it was almost like the demand for role-playing game content was met with these live web chats and Rule of 3 and all this other stuff. And meanwhile, you're also building the actual game, right?
The open playtest was super, super valuable to us because it was the first time we were able to leverage the technology of the internet in a really focused and positive way to improve our own designs. And like the game wouldn't be as good. Like I'm super proud of 5th edition D&D, and it wouldn't be as good as it is, in my opinion, if we didn't have that process, because we were able to get sort of the reality check from hundreds of thousands of fans who were super invested in a game with a 40-year legacy. Like we said from the very beginning that our goal with 5th edition is not to be like the owners of D&D, but to be the stewards of D&D. Like we're ushering D&D forward on the behalf of all the people that love it and whose lives have been touched by it and changed by it. And the open playtest process and being able to be being able to talk to people and have them talk back to me was just invaluable, right? Like even things like going to a convention. When I'd go to Gen Con, and I had 1 year at Gen Con that all I did the entire show basically was ran the character creation seminar that was like, come learn how to create a character and then just ask questions, right? And I did that literally from open to close of Gen Con for 3 straight days. They did give me 1 day off, right? And that was so valuable because like I just got to stand there and talk to people about D&D, and I learned not just like, okay, you know, what do you like and what do you not like, but I got to hear these personal stories and like what was your aha moment with the game, or what was, you know, all these things that were very human touchstones that kind of remind you like, yeah, we're not just creating classes and races and feats and monsters and stuff like that. We're creating stories that people tell. We're not creating like, I don't mean like the adventure story. I mean the story of we were so screwed, we all jumped in the minecart, but then the minecart was careening off the cliff. Like that's the kind of stories that the work that we put in as a team was designed to help create, right? And it's gratifying to hear it back, but it's also a really great touchstone because you then take that back and you say like, okay, what can we do in the game's design to engender more of those moments?
Well, and I think it's definitely achieved that. You know, I think 5th edition is by far my favorite edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and it is many people's favorite edition. Talk to people about D&D all the time, and it seems to be like the widely held opinion across the board. And one of the things that is great is this idea of story first. And, you know, we're not going to build something unless we sort of have a story-motivated reason to do so. You know, we're not going to build a race that has +2 wisdom just to give people a race with +2 wisdom. We're going to think about it, and we're going to motivate it. And also the return to the weird was great. You know, it felt like maybe in 3rd and 4th edition a little bit, there was sort of this normalizing of things that were supposed to feel alien or inhuman. And 5th edition just seems to lovingly embrace the weird colony gender neutral minds of Myconids, you know, or
right.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. So it was awesome to see that implemented. Was it a big moment for you when you found out? Like, were you called into somebody's office and it was like, hey, guess what? There's going to be a new edition of D&D, and we need you to start working on it. Like, what was sort of was there rumors around the office? Was it a shock? You know, how did all that come about?
Not really. It kind of actually went in the opposite direction. One of the great things about working in Wizards R&D was that there were always conversations going on around like what if we did things this way, or what if we made a class that did this, or what if we told stories this way, right? And I would say it was more a natural like evolution of like spitballing ideas, and like, you know, someone would say like, hey, what if we had a task resolution that did X, Y, and Z, or like what if we distilled everything down to, you know, ability checks or whatever these ideas were. And we just sort of at one point through all these conversations and spitballing had hit this critical mass, and someone was just like, let's try this, let's see what works, right? I've told the story before, but the very first, I will use air quotes around this, but the very first play test of D&D 5th edition there was no character creation rules. There was no written rules at all. In fact, there was an adventure and there were 4 or 5 characters. And we had designed these characters with no inherent structure behind them that was just like, okay, you know, what kinds of things should I be able to do, right? And tinkered and put those together. And like I remember somebody that wasn't even a designer in D&D R&D was like, hey, I've got this idea for how sneak attack could work, and it could work like this. And we're like, sure, let's try it and throw it in, right? And so we basically built these characters that were just, you know, like this is what we think a character should look like, right? And we played it, and that became the proving ground for like, yeah, we can have a much leaner core system that then has these other things that plug into it or whatever. So it was much more organic than like someone making the decision like, okay, we are doing 5th edition. It actually got sort of proved out in a like random off the cuff playtest first, and then once we were like, okay, we think we've got something here, then people who were, you know, managers and leaders and stuff like that were able to go and say like, okay, if we are going to make this, you know, the next edition of D&D, what's all the work that needs to go into that kind of thing? So it kind of went in the other direction, but again, that's drastically oversimplifying it, because there's, you know, I'm distilling hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations down into a 5-minute story. So
Of course.
that's a huge oversimplification. And I bet if you went and asked like Mike Merles or Jeremy or one of those guys, they would have a completely different perspective on it, right? That it just like, you know, came in at a different time. But because I'm focusing on it from like the design side of things and the first first playtest side of things, or like maybe I wasn't involved in a conversation that was happening, right? But it was very like it was the game that sort of grew out of, or it was the project that grew out of a game in a lot of ways. And then once we were like, okay, we think this thing has legs, there was a lot of like, now let's go back to the drawing board and figure out like what are our core goals, right? And what are our, basic tenets of design, and like what are we trying to accomplish with this game? Because at that point we're not creating an adventure and 4 characters. We got to create a whole game that everybody can play, and we got to how are we going to treat the IP, and like what's the story going to be behind monsters and this and that. And that process was lengthy, right? It was a lot of figuring out like what is the best possible thing we can do for the game to honor everything that's come before, but also make something that we think hits the goals that we have now that might be different than goals we had 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 40 years ago or whatever, right? So that process became like, okay, the real like, let's figure out what our signposts are going to be that we're going to follow through the entire design. And that was much longer. That was significantly longer than it took to write one adventure. Let's put it that way.
Well, it was incredible. And, you set these goals at the beginning of the process, and I think they've been hit, right? And I think the strength of Dungeons & Dragons now shows that. Hey, everybody, just wanted to take a quick break to let you know all about Audible.com, this week's sponsor for Tabletop Babble. For you, the listeners of Tabletop Babble, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their amazing audiobook service. I recommend you check out The Devil You Know, a Brimstone Angels novel by the one and only and amazing author Aaron M. Evans. Diana Perlman, who reads this, is awesome. So I think this should be your free audiobook. But you can go get whatever you want. There are thousands of titles. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/DSPN. Again, that's audibletrial.com/DSPN. All right, let's get back to my conversation with Rodney. So when you left to go work at Bungie, I think within the community there was this little like, oh, I wonder if Rodney will ever sort of come back and do something. And then maybe about 6 months later, I saw this tweet from you that was all about this new tabletop role-playing game you were working on, and you weren't able to share a lot of details yet, and you weren't quite sure what it is. And now there's a Kickstarter for it. It's called Dusk City Outlaws. And, I won't bury the lead here. I got to play it last night here at Winter Fantasy, and it is so much fun. Talk to me a little bit about that. What is Dusk City Outlaws, and what made you decide to come back and do some more tabletop stuff?
Sure. Well, it's easier for me to answer that second one and then lead into the first one. So, when I first started Bungie, I was like, okay, I've got to give myself, a good 6 months, if not more, just to get used to working on video games, because that was a huge difference in design, and I was learning a whole lot. And I'm still learning a whole lot, right? I don't want to make it sound like, and now I'm the expert, because that's sure not true, right? But like, I was like, I can't not give this 100% of my effort. But eventually things sort of settled down, and I got more comfortable, and I started sliding into my role more efficiently, and started. Well, I mean, I can't not tinker with things is sort of what it boils down to. I have to be messing with things. And so I had this sort of confluence of multiple things that all came together at once. It was like, okay, I've got an idea for a dice resolution system. And boy, I sure would love to make an RPG that has really strong factions. And man, I wonder why nobody's done a tabletop RPG that's designed to hit the table really fast and, sort of comes in like a board game, or, if they have, like, why haven't I played it yet? Right. And things like that. And so it was like sort of this whirlwind of like 4 or 5 critical elements that all came together. And eventually it was like, okay, I think I've got the shell of an RPG here that I can work on. And plus, like, I've got a lot of creative energy, and because of the video game industry obviously takes security very seriously. So unlike with other industries, there's no working from home for me, right? Like when I leave the studio, that's it. There's no working from home at all. So it's like I want to work on a side project, and I'm just going to work on something until I think that it's good enough to put in front of other people, or until I decide, like, nope, this sucks, I don't want to do this anymore, right? And so I started working on the game that would become Dusk City Outlaws, and it was sort of the combination of, like, okay, I want a game that comes off the shelf easily and hits the table fast and doesn't require prep time, because there's a lot of times when we have a game night and I want to play an RPG, but I can't because no one's done any prep work. And so we play a board game instead, and that's fine. I love board games, but sometimes I want to play an RPG. Like, I had that idea and I was like, okay, what does it take to make that happen? It's like, well, you got to get character creation down really fast, and you got to get, you got to take the burden off of the person running the game to do a lot of prep work in advance. And, it sort of distilled it down to, like, what are the core needs of a game that can do this? And what it all kind of came back to was shifting a lot of the work responsibility off of the game master onto the players, right? And a lot of indie RPGs do this really well, where they feel more like shared storytelling or shared world building in a lot of ways. And I was like, okay, that sounds really good. I really want to do that. And I've been playing some sort of player-driven RPGs where the players are the main drivers of the story. But one of the things that I knew that a game like that was going to need was a really clear call to action, right? I think one of the best examples of this is Shadowrun, right? Shadowrun has a very clear call to action. It's got sort of a ritual to it. It's like, okay, you get the job from Mr. Johnson, you come up with a plan, you do the job, and then boom, you do it all over again because you're always broke because you spent all your money, right? and I think, like, games like Shadowrun that have a core call to action like that, even D&D kind of has that if you're playing the very traditional, like, you meet a wizard in a tavern and he gives you a job and you go to the dungeon, right? So I had to have a clear call to action. And when I looked at it, it was like, okay, if I'm going to have this call to action and I want this to be something that can be played in a finite space and I want it to be very player driven, what kind of genre am I looking at there? And the heist genre came to mind because, like, you watch a movie like Ocean's 11 and it's a bunch of guys come together and they come up with a plan and then they execute that plan and then it's done and you move on to the next one. Or a movie like The Sting, right? Or TV shows like Leverage. Like, these are all great examples of, they have this very finite gameplay that's very driven by the protagonists coming up with their plan, but also, like, there's a very clear goal, right? It's always like, we're going to steal this diamond, we're going to rob this guy, we're going to, rob this casino, whatever, right? Yeah. And so once I had it in my head that I was like, okay, I'm looking at a heist genre game. I'm looking at a game that's going to shift, a lot of the world building and driving responsibilities on the players. I started thinking, like, okay, what am I going to do for my setting here? And I'd had that idea for, like, the really faction heavy game. Like, I had a really great experience with Legend of the Five Rings. I was like, I'd love to have something like that. And that's what led me to eventually what became, like, the setting of the game, right? And so the end result is that Dusk City Outlaws is a game where is a tabletop RPG where the players take on the role of a band of criminals. And these criminals are drawn from 8 different cartels that are these very big and colorful and vivid factions that rule over the criminal underworld of this massive fantasy city. And it's sort of like Renaissance Venice, but on the scale of modern day New York. Really huge, infinite number of story possibilities in there. And the players are the ones that are going to come up with the plan. They're given a job by a broker, and they have to come up with that plan themselves. There is no right way to do the job. It's all a complete sandbox. And then they come up with a plan, they go out into the city and do legwork to set up that plan, and then eventually they execute whatever plan they've come up with. And it's on them to plan and execute. It's on the judge to react. And so it basically offloads a lot of the effort onto the players. And that means that the game can hit the table quickly and still give you that satisfying role-playing experience. It was really important to me early on that this be the kind of game where it has that sort of largely linear flow of, we're doing things in a chronological order, because I felt like part of what makes it satisfying when you pull off a good plan is that you could have failed, right? Like, maybe your plan could have been bad. Your plan could have not taken something into account, right? And so in order to do that, I really wanted to say, like, yeah, you're going to make a plan, and that's your plan. Good or bad or flawed or, not taking everything into account. That's your plan, and you've got to deal with it, all right? And you've got to deal with any complications that arise as a result of that plan. And that was important to me because I want players to feel that surge of satisfaction that comes with, we attempted something that could have failed, and we succeeded because of our own creativity and cleverness. And so that is how everything drove towards the game that you played last night at Winter Fantasy.
Well, I have to say, it was an amazing time. I had a lot of fun. It was super quick character creation. And one of the things I loved, so our group, right, 24 Karat Excellence.
Nice. So good.
Yeah. That lets you know what sort of game it was, probably. But it's this great mission that we played, really fun. And on its surface, it's like, oh, okay, I recognize this story. I know what kind of my role is. So you are able to pick it up and go right away. And then the mechanics are simple, but they're also so fun and so unique. I definitely want to talk to you about Heat.
Yeah.
And that mechanic. But before I do, I just wanted to tell you that I've run into other people. So shout out to Derek Gruder, who is running a lot of the games here, the Dusk City Outlaw games here at Winter Fantasy. So I've run into a lot of other people that he's run through the same scenario. And every group has approached it differently. Yeah. Every single group has a completely different story that totally works. So you can really approach these scenarios in any way, and yet they're so thin. The DM doesn't need to do a lot of prep. Your game masters don't have to do a ton of prep. So it really does live up to those promises that you are talking about. And it was just a blast. Cool. We were up talking about it for a long time afterwards last night. So we probably finished, we finished around a little bit before 1 a.m, and I wasn't in bed till 2. So,
okay.
So it was a great time.
Let me ask you a question first, though.
Oh, sure.
Tell me what your character was.
Okay. So my character was a Vesper mastermind.
Nice.
Yeah, and that was super fun because it was kind of like I felt like I was, this noble class of villains who have sort of infiltrated, right, the bureaucracy of government and the higher ranks. And then the mastermind is kind of like Hannibal from the A-Team, right?
Right, yes.
Yeah. So it was great to sort of have that combination of things come together. And it was like, okay, so I'm like a super fancy Hannibal, right? Like that's
right.
And that's kind of the way I played it. I was like, all right, so what if instead of like smoking cigars and loving it when a plan comes together, he was super prim and proper and all that kind of stuff. And awesome. So it was great. It was just such a blast to play that out. And then of course, like, we also had Gronk, the brawler, who was constantly, just pulling on levers to see what worked and that kind of thing. So it really was, and it was. But this heat mechanic, that is where the big twists in the game come. So talk a little bit about how heat works.
Sure. So there's 2 main tools that I put into the game that are designed to sort of carry through that theme of like, okay, the game master doesn't need to do a lot of prep work in order to create a satisfying game, because not only do you have to like know what's true about the world, but you need these sort of twists and turns and unexpected moments and obstacles and challenges that surprise you as a player for it to be interesting. Because otherwise it would just be like, yep, we're going through the motions of, coming up with a plan or whatever. You need that sense of unexpected plot twists in order to, have that level of excitement about the game. And so what the heat mechanic is basically as the players are out in the city doing things, whether it's, legwork or committing actual crimes or whatever, they're generating heat. And heat is a measure of how much impact these criminals are having on the law-abiding citizens of the city, and also how the law-abiding citizens of the city react to that impact, right? So it means that, like, you've been out there committing a bunch of crimes or, picking pockets or breaking into places, and the citizens are starting to get worried, and they're starting to complain to the city watch or their senator or whatever, and eventually heat starts to build up, and heat becomes a resource that the judge then spends to introduce complications. And the judge spends heat to introduce complications at 2 times. One is right before a scene starts, so that, like, one of the players is like, yeah, I'm going to go break into this guy's house. And then the judge might say, like, okay, I'm going to spend some heat. And his guards have actually been doubled for the evening because of all the crimes that have been committed in the area, right? So that's one way to do it. And what that does is that sets up obstacles that then other players want to come along and help overcome, because there's kind of a rule in the game that, like, you can't do everything yourself, right? Like, yes, you could try to take out the guards and steal the document, but if you do, you're going to be distracted and you're going to have these challenges that are going to come up, and it's not a great idea. Whereas if you bring somebody along with you, they can deal with the guards, or some people along with you, right? It might be more than one person. They can deal with the guards while you deal with stealing things. That also ties in really well with how I think, like, a lot of cinematic heist movie scenes go, right, where everybody has their specialty and the face man is out front distracting the guards while the thief is sneaking around the back, and the mole is dressed in the guard's uniform and everything. And it basically creates this inherent need for teamwork by introducing these challenges, these complications up front. And then the other way they can come in is when a player is making a roll to do the thing in a scene, whatever that is, right? Like, yeah, I'm going to steal the document. I make my roll to sneak around. If that player fails, as the judge, I can say, like, okay, well, you still steal the document, but I'm going to spend a bunch of heat to introduce a complication. So, like, yeah, you steal the document, but right as you're walking out the door, the guy that owns the house walks around the corner and walks right into you, and now he's going to raise the alarm, so you have to deal with this guy that owns the house before he can raise the alarm. And that's sort of the other impromptu way in the middle of a scene that you spend heat. And what this does, like I said, it takes the pressure off of the scenarios themselves to provide a lot of challenges, and it also means that the judge doesn't have to improvise challenges from the entire galaxy of possibilities. It's like, no, here's like a menu of things you can choose from, and the judge can kind of base the challenges that are introduced on the nature of the narrative as it stands at that moment, right? Because I even give this advice in the rules. I'm like, hey, there's going to be a lot of times where you're going to look at these menu options, you're going to be like, yeah, none of these actually make any sense right now, or like this is the only one that actually makes any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense for, like, yeah, I steal the document and I'm about to sneak out, and all of a sudden a dozen dogs bust into the room. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? So it's up to the judge to come up with the context, but that also means that you can kind of tailor these narrative twists and turns to the moment in a way that makes things more exciting and more interesting. So that carries a huge chunk of the weight that would normally be carried by a scenario, and then also kind of the game does put a lot of trust in the judge to sort of read the table and understand, like, okay, things are slowing down. I need to, spice things up. Now I'm going to introduce a complication to get the momentum back up in the group.
It gives the judge those tools, right? With heat, it makes the judge feel okay saying, like, oh, okay, this shouldn't go smoothly, like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe they had a great plan, right? But now it's time for me to add a kink. And with that menu of suggestions and with all of the heat, that you've accumulated, it's easy for that judge to say, like, oh, okay, yeah, now I can introduce a complication. And it also, influence provides a way for players to say, oh, okay, now it's my moment to shine. It does feel very cinematic when you use your influence, because there's all these sort of things you can do based on who your character is and what they're good at, right? Like, you can be the janitor in the background all of a sudden in a scene, or you can trigger a flashback with it where it's like, oh yeah, but we did, plan a bomb for plan B just in case earlier. And that's amazing too, that players have the ability to go in and sort of edit scenes and push the plot forward and call in favors. Like, that is amazing, and it really feels super, super cinematic with all of that going on.
Well, I mean, a lot of the inspiration was from movies and TV shows, right? One of my goals for all of the different player specialties in the game, and the game is going to ship with, I'll say, at least 16 unique specialties. My goal is that each one of those has some kind of narrative bending special ability to it. And some of them are pretty, like, heavy-handed in that it's like, okay, you're the mole. You can just pick a guy in the scene and be like, oh yeah, that random guard back there, that's actually me in disguise. So you've got some that are very overt like that, but then you've got some other ones that are a little bit more subtle that lean on the player's use of them, right? Like the assassin has the ability to take out people silently without them, making any noise and alerting any guards. And the assassin also has the ability to take out groups of minions, which are sort of the people that you can take out with a single hit. They get advantage dice on that. And so there's this nice little combo that's like, okay, if I'm the assassin, the way that I can really twist things in our favor in this scene is I'm the guy that goes after all of the mooks that are there. Like I sneak around. I'm going to be the silent obstacle removal person, right? But it's not up to complete chance. You've got this ability that's like, okay, I'm going to mute the sound. And so you can kind of create these cinematic moments where it's like, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to take these guys out. And like, actually the assassin has one that's like, if there is just one minion by himself, you take them out, right? Like there's no die rolling or whatever. So like, yep, there's the one lone guard on the door. You just describe how you do that, right? Or like the thief has the ability to, you can just get into any building you want to. Now, once you're inside, you might have to deal with problems, but like you basically get to narrate how you break into any building that you want to, right? And so if you pick one of the towering skyscrapers that are in the city, like, yeah, you can say like, yep, the way I got in was I climbed up the side of the building with a harness and an alchemical like sticky gloves or whatever, and I cut my way through the glass, and that's how I got inside. And you just get to say that because that's your character's forte, is getting into places. Now, I can't make it so easy that you can just, bust the game by like, yep, I get in and I just leave, right? There's definitely got to be an element of like, okay, once you're in, you still got to deal with any guards or, security measures that are there. But everybody has some ability to twist the story. And sometimes it's a highly creative thing where it's like, oh, okay, you asked the judge what the nature of the security systems are in this area, and if the judge doesn't have an answer for you, you get to make that up yourself, right? And so it's just like, oh, okay, well, now I make up things that are easy for us to bypass, or that another player in the group knows how to bypass, etc., right? So there's definitely a focus on giving every player's specialty one thing at least that is really narrative twisting focused.
So is this a game that, when you were building it, is it designed for one-shots? Is it designed to support longer campaigns? Definitely last night, the state we left the city in made me feel like, oh yeah, we could totally come back to this story with this same group of people and see like what's happening now in their lives. How's it changed,
Yeah. Yeah, so it is definitely my primary goal is to have it be that no matter what form the final rules and components take, that it's always the kind of game that you can pull off the shelf and play at a moment's notice, which means very streamlined character creation. Mm-hmm. However, I have some campaign rules which I will be previewing probably not this coming week, but maybe the week after on the Kickstarter site, that the focus of the campaign rules is on those ongoing storylines and recurring characters. And so basically, instead, like you still can gain XP in the game, but you don't ever like gain new, like your skills don't go up or anything like that because they're put on your sheet. You're already an expert, right?
You start pretty badass already. Yeah.
You start out as an expert, so your skills aren't going to go up, but you get XP, which you can spend through the course of the game to, get more influence or get some advantage dice, things like that. That's sort of the light touch progression mechanic because it goes into a pool and everybody in the crew can spend it. But then there's also the idea of recurring characters and story conflicts. And both of these things are they basically boil down to whenever you voluntarily add this thing to a scene that you're describing, it progresses. And when they progress far enough, basically you hit a climactic moment. So like you've got a recurring NPC, like this NPC is someone that we ran into in, this other heist that we did. And we chose we chose this guy to be a recurring NPC. And so now I'm going to narrate a scene and say, okay, I'm going to break into this guy's house, to keep using the, example from earlier. I'm going to break into this guy's house and he is going to be, the person that is there on the inside that lets me in, and that's how I sneak in or whatever, right? And so every time an NPC that you've just designated as a recurring NPC comes back again, they sort of progress along a track. And every time they show up, they help you more and more. Or conversely, if it's like a recurring villain, they hurt you more and more. They get tougher, or they impose stiffer penalties. And over time, eventually, like, they will have appeared in enough jobs and enough scenes and enough jobs that now all of a sudden they get to have their climactic moment, whether it's, now we finally have our showdown with this recurring villain, or now we have sort of the curtain call for this ally who, maybe he gets threatened with arrest or exiled from the city, or held hostage or whatever. You have this climactic moment that once it's resolved, that basically, that recurring character now leaves the campaign and makes room for other ones, right? And then you've got these story conflicts that are basically like, you pick a conflict that's important to your character, and it might be like my cartel versus another cartel, or it might be like a character or an organization that wants revenge on me or whatever. It's some inherent conflict that, again, every time you introduce it into a scene, it progresses. And then once it's progressed far enough, you have a climactic moment where you finally resolve that conflict, or at least resolve it well enough. And that's when you start getting your character progression stuff. And that's when you basically, every time you resolve one of your story conflicts, you get a special mechanical benefit, right? And it could be something like you get a new follower that basically joins your crew. He's like a low-level grunt from cartel that now joins your crew, or it could be something like you get a promotion in your cartel, and that comes with other, benefits or whatever. So that's like the main avenue for like your personal progression, but it all plays out not through like you gained a bunch of XP, but through this story conflict that you have chosen to be important to you, appeared a bunch of times through a bunch of different scenes, and then finally got resolved in a climactic moment. So going with something that's very storyline driven. I like to think of it like anybody that watches Leverage, there's a recurring character named Sterling, who is an insurance investigator that is a thorn in the side of the crew, and he shows up every now and then, and he makes things hard on them, but eventually that conflict gets resolved, and that's a major sort of beat moment for the crew, right? And so like that's the goal that I'm going for with the campaign system.
Yeah, that is awesome, and that's great to hear, because I didn't even think last night about leveling up. I was thinking about, like, where could the story go from here? So I think it makes sense to have that more story-driven approach, especially with this game. I love that.
Yeah.
So the game is Dusk City Outlaws. It is kickstarting right now. Rodney, you already have my money, but people, it is so worth it. The man is Rodney Thompson. Rodney, where can people go if they want to find out more about you and Dusk City Outlaws and what you're doing?
Sure. Well, you can go to the website I've set up for the game. You can go to duskcityoutlaws.com. And that'll take you to the website that I've set up for it. You can also go straight to the Kickstarter by going to tinyurl.com/Dusk City Outlaws. Pretty easy there. And then the best place to catch me is you can either email me through the website form on the duskcityoutlaws.com website, or you can catch me on Twitter at Antarian Ranger, which is a Star Wars Expanded Universe reference.
And we will put all of that information in the show notes for this episode on our website. Head on over to don'tsplitthepodcasts.com. Rodney Thompson, thank you so much. This is huge. I've been wanting to talk to you for years, so I'm so glad that you were able to come on. Thank you for making time to talk with me today.
No, it's my pleasure, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Tabletop Babble is still a new show, and the best way to help it grow and to help others find it is to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your podcatching platform of choice is. To encourage you to do just that, I'm reading one new 5-star review verbatim each episode and crediting the person who left it. Make me say anything you want. Today's review comes from Knight Errant Jr. Knight Errant Jr.'s review says, strong out of the gate. This is a relatively new podcast, but it's being done by longtime RPG podcasters, and it's strong out of the gate, with good interviews and guests. Initially, I had assumed a more specific D&D focus, but it appears the show is going to be more ambitious, as it takes on topics like superhero RPGs as well. Thank you so much for this review, Knight Errant Jr. We are going to be super ambitious, and we are going to take on all kinds of stuff. We want to know what you love about the show, so come give us a great review and make me say anything at all that you want. And if you want to support the show financially, there's an easy way to do it that doesn't cost you anything extra. Before you shop on Amazon or DriveThruRPG, go to our website, don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com, and click on the banners on the left. Heck, bookmark them once you get there to make it easy on yourself. Then you just shop as you normally would. It costs you nothing extra and throws a few pennies on the dollar of your sale our way. Okay, people, you can find out about everything I do at Twitter at James Introcaso and on my website, worldbuilderblog.me. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Special thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Until next time, remember that RPGs are like sex. If everyone's having fun, you're doing it right.